Dennis Wrigley Ministries, a better way, unity, renewal and healing.
Occult practices always lead to casualties, in my experience. People who are sucked into a variety of occultic activities, playing around with Ouija boards at the lesser end of the scale, but people who then are sucked into pagan rites and then beyond that into satanic rites, are people who become very, very damaged, often quite deranged. Some would say possessed. Any Christian community which is involved in healing inevitably will be approached by victims of these practices. And it's important for us to understand how this works. It's important for us to understand that what matters more than anything else is that we accept people as we find them. For example, a vicar came with a lady here, and he said, "This woman is in immense distress. She's been to counsellors and doctors and services of one sort and another, and she's made no progress. She was born into a family which was indulging in the most appalling and horrific child abuse. It was a satanic cult, in effect. She'd been kept in a cellar until the age of 9, and her birth had never been registered. She had no self-respect. She had no self-love. Her whole countenance was dead. And as she came into my home, her hair was over her face, and she could not express anything. She was impassive, like stone. We asked whether she would like us to pray for her, and she said yes. And we said a prayer which the church has prayed for centuries. Some call it the prayer of abandonment. A group of us just prayed and asked God to take her as she was at that moment in all her misery. And as she lay down on the floor, we prayed for her senses, the 5 senses. And as I laid my hands on her eyes and asked God to cleanse her from all that she'd ever seen, which was destructive and ugly and corrupt, I myself had terrible visions, awful visions. She was at peace. I placed my hands on her ears, and I prayed that her ears would be cleansed of all that she'd ever heard. And I heard a terrible cacophony of shrieks and horrible, horrible sounds. But she was at peace. I then prayed for her nose and her breathing passages. And I then experienced the most appalling stench, the smell of cellars, where she'd apparently lived for those first 9 years of her life. And I then prayed for her mouth, for the food and other things which she'd been forced to ingest, for the words that she'd been forced to speak, ugly words. I cleansed her mouth in prayer. And then we took her hands and we asked God to cleanse these hands of all pollution, all the things that she'd been forced to do against her will. And when that had happened, we then prayed for her mind and all the confused thoughts which had been implanted within her. We asked God to cleanse her mind. And we prayed for her heart, for her emotion, and ask God to set her free from all the terrible rejections and pains and sorrows which had been inflicted upon her. And then one of the ladies placed her hand on her stomach. That's where pain manifests itself. And we declared, perfect love casts out fear. And suddenly things began to happen. And as we asked for all the nastiness, all the horror and corruption to be removed, and all the spirits that were real and destructive to go, we began to see a woman being set free. And finally, when we finished praying, she lay on the floor quietly, breathing deeply, at peace. And we then offered her in entirety to the Lord. And we prayed that she would become a new creation, that all the years during which she had been deprived of love, all the robbery which had taken place, would be cancelled, swept on one side. And then when we'd finished and she sat up, her face was transformed. And she began to tell me what she'd experienced. When I'd prayed for her eyes, she'd seen beautiful flowers in fields. When I'd prayed for her ears, she'd heard the most beautiful music. When I prayed for her nose, she smelt the most beautiful scent. I think she said home cooking. And again, when I touched her lips, she was given words of great beauty. And it seemed to me that God did something which to this day I can't fully understand, but it was powerful. I smelt foul stenches. I saw horrible things. I heard shrieks. But my sister had not. And as we prayed for her, we then took authority over any shadow which was cast upon her life. We commanded anything in there which should not be there to go. Whatever it is, it went. She sprang to her feet, and she virtually danced out of that room. I've never seen such transformation in my life. Sheila, my wife, will bear this out. In the course of only an hour or so, we saw with our very eyes a woman who had clearly been set free. Was this a sudden, passing emotional experience? No. She was healed, fundamentally, permanently. All the horror was left behind. All the ugliness was there, never to return. And she began to live a normal, healthy, good life. But above all, she experienced herself the mighty power of God to heal and to save. This, you see, had been an experience of reality. A lot of people couldn't even believe her story. We went to the trouble of verifying it. She had been terribly abused. There are today many occultic groups that do just that to children, all over Britain, all over the world. Some people find it very difficult to believe that or to accept it, but it's true. We live in a fallen world and terrible things are done to children. But praise God, this woman became a new creation. And whereas before she could not smile, these muscles changed and she had the most glorious smile. And whereas before her shoulders were down, her hands were down, she suddenly became full of life and vibrant. And she was able to dance. She was able to live. That's just one example. But if we are about God's work, He will bring to us people such as her. We have no special power. Folk who claim to be healers are deceiving themselves. It's only God who heals. We are merely instruments of His healing. But the great joy is that he gives us proof of the healing. I'm a great believer in following up what has happened. I was able to speak to some of the social workers and some of the doctors who had been trying to help her, and priests and ministers. The great joy was we saw with our very eyes a very precious human being being transformed into the person God always intended her to be. What joy we all experienced. And I thank God that over and over again in Maranatha community, people are led in their need, and we see with our very eyes total transformation. This is what the gospel of Jesus Christ is all about. God bless you.
Dennis Wrigley Ministries, a better way, unity, renewal and healing. Thank you for watching.